So today we're going to have a presentation about big data and data science. We were fortunate enough, some of us have heard this presentation before by Lisa Federer at the NIH Library. And she's going to talk about what is big data and give us an introduction to data science techniques that can be used to analyze it. And she'll also talk about how data science can help researchers find meaning in data and discuss some of the common techniques and tools used in a variety of research areas. It's a term we're hearing a lot about, especially here at the U.S. Library of Medicine, and we thought others may want to hear this. It was very informative. And Lisa, I'm going to turn this over to you, and we're unmuting your phone, I guess, and I think we've turned the screen over to you.
Great. So can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be able to get to share some of this info with all of you today. So as Elizabeth said, this is going to be sort of an introduction to data science. It's a very broad topic that we'll just cover some of the highlights of in this session. So I want to talk a little bit first about the concept of big data and what we're talking about when we refer to big data. Then we'll talk a little bit about data science and how that's different from some of the other scientific techniques that you might be familiar with. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the processes and methods that are used in data science. And then look at some of the things that we are possibly going to see ahead in the future with some of the developments in data science. And then I'll really briefly sort of tie this back into libraries and talk about some of the services that we're providing at the NIH Library and some opportunities for libraries in this sort of area. So to start out, big data, what exactly is it? It is a buzzword that we hear quite a lot in a lot of different areas, including scientific research, but a lot of times people are using this term without really knowing what the definition of big data is. How big does data have to be big data? What's medium data? What's small data? What makes big data different? And so I think it's really important to sort of understand that before we can talk about what we're doing with this data. And there's a lot of different definitions for big data, but the one that I think is really useful comes from, I believe it originally came from IBM, and they define big data in terms of the 4 V's. So the first V is volume, how much of it there is. So that sort of gets back to this idea of big data being data that there's a lot of. How do we define what sort of volume makes data big data? One of the ways of thinking about that and defining that is that when a data set becomes large enough that we can no longer use traditional computational tools on it, that is then big data. So if you've ever had the experience, for example, of trying to open a very large spreadsheet in Excel, you may know that Excel can't really handle more than 1 million lines of data, and when you start to get a very large data set that approaches that number, it gets really slow, it doesn't work so well. So we've sort of run into the problem there that this tool that we're trying to use is not scalable to the volume of data that we're trying to deal with. So there are a lot of new sorts of computational resources and techniques that people are looking into to allow us to work more effectively with these large data sets. That's a very active area of research to sort of develop some of the tools that we would need to work with very large volumes of data. The size of the data, though, is not the only thing that distinguishes big data. Another thing that makes big data a little different to work with is the variety of the different types of data that we're working with. So I think a really good example of this comes from clinical medicine. So if I'm running a clinical trial, I have a lot of different patients, and for each patient, I probably have a lot of different types of information. I might have, some vital signs that I took from them. I might have like the history, of who has been ill in their family, probably written out in some sort of narrative text. I would probably have something like maybe some scans, some MRI, some CT images. I may have, video or audio. So there's all these different types of data that we need from, different formats, different kinds of media, that all come together to give us information about an individual or a scientific concept. And figuring out the ways to incorporate those many different types of data can be really challenging as well. The third V is velocity, and this has to do with essentially how quickly data are able to be generated or gathered. So one of the things that is pretty cool about the technology that we have today is that we're able to gather data at a really rapid rate, more quickly than we ever have been able to in the past. And often we're able to gather that data more quickly than we're able to analyze it. A good example of this is if you're sort of looking at the physics realm, there's the Large Hadron Collider in, I believe, Switzerland, and the experiments that they do take just a couple of seconds to run, but it generates so much data in just those few seconds that it's like months worth of data for teams all around the world to work with. So, with that technology comes a lot of data, and we're not quite at the point yet where we're able to deal with it in real time in terms of the analysis. So this is one of the challenges that we're working with as well. And then the final of the 4 V's is veracity. And this sort of deals with the idea that when we're working with very large data sets, typically most people are not generating big data on their own. They're taking data from a repository, or they're working with some sort of a collaborative, like I mentioned, the Large Hadron Collider. So it's not, when you would go into your lab back in the traditional days, do an experiment, gather some data, and you sort of know where that data came from. You know how good of quality it is because you collected it. In these sorts of situations where we're working with these more sort of big data sets that maybe came from lots of different sources or a source that we're not familiar with, we don't necessarily know what the quality of the data is, and we don't necessarily know how accurate maybe the metadata might be that goes along with that data. So another challenge that we really need to think about when we're talking about big data is what can we do in terms of documenting data and documenting workflows that lead to that data to make sure that we have good, high-quality data that we're able to use on the other end. So now, hopefully this gives you a sense of what we're really talking about when we talk about big data. It's not just sort of a term that's thrown around. It actually refers to a very specific type or quality of data. So how did we, whoops, I just clicked something I shouldn't, there we go, okay. So how did we arrive at the place where we're able to take advantage of big data? How do we get from the point that we would have an individual gathering data in a lab to, working with kinds of big data sets? One of the drivers behind this is that we have faster and cheaper technology, and it's getting even faster and, more cheap. The graph that you're looking at here on the screen shows the cost of sequencing a single human genome over time. And you can see that it's dropped really quickly, especially between like 2008 and the present. It's gotten very, very cheap for us to sequence a single human genome. And it's not on this chart, but it's also gotten a lot quicker. So the first human genome that was sequenced in the Human Genome Research Project, that took about 10 years, cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion. Today, a single human genome can be sequenced in about 24 hours, and it costs about $1,000. So in just, about 10 to 15 years, we've seen the cost of things go way down. So we have technology that allows us to gather this data much more cheaply. And in addition to that, storage is also getting cheaper. So not only can we create or collect the data, we're also able to keep it and, in some cases, keep it indefinitely. We're also sort of seeing a change in the ways that data are gathered. We are surrounded in, our everyday lives in many cases by data gathering devices, essentially. You probably have a data gathering device very close to you. My iPhone is sitting right next to me. And, we think of it as just sort of a phone or a little mini computer, but the iPhone is collecting data about us and about the world around us all the time. And there are a lot of other devices like this as well. Some of them are sort of, consumer devices, things like your Fitbit that's counting the number of steps that you take. That piece of jewelry that the woman is wearing in the picture next to the Fitbit is something sort of similar. It counts your steps, and it also is able to detect your respiratory rate, so it knows if you're stressed out and that kind of thing. And then there's a lot of sort of in the wild sensors that are small, cheap, things like the RFID, little piece of plastic that you see on the screen there, very cheap to make and to collect data with. And a lot of these things are sort of collecting data for a particular purpose, but that data can be reused for another purpose entirely. So the Fitbit data, if I'm wearing a Fitbit, I'm probably just thinking that I'm collecting that to monitor my own health, see if I need to exercise more. But there's actual, research potential for some of that data that I, the individual user, might not even think of. So one example of that is there is, you may have heard of 23andMe, where you can, get your genetic sequence. And a lot of people have donated their genetic sequence data to research, and they have also tied in with that their Fitbit data. So these researchers have, these two different data sets to sort of work with and get information about the people that have donated that data. So a lot of the things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as particularly being research data can be repurposed for that, especially now that we're gathering so much data around us all the time. There's also been an increase in what's called born digital data. So we have a lot of tools around us that we can use to collect data in a digital form, as opposed to having to convert data from an analog form to a digital form. So for example, electronic health records mean that we have a lot of patient data that now exists in a digital form. And there are, of course, privacy implications to what we can do with that data. But we do have that data a lot more easily accessible than back before the age of electronic health records. In that case, patient records would have been on paper in a physician's office, in a hospital, many different places. You would have to have digitized all of that. It would have been really challenging. But now, all of that data sort of exists in a digital form. We also have, when we're looking at more sort of lab research as opposed to clinical research, the laboratory notebook is sort of the gold standard for recording information about an experiment that you're conducting. And, that typically has been in the form of, pen and paper, an actual physical notebook. But a lot of researchers are moving to electronic lab notebook solutions where they're entering their data, into a computer, or sort of a middle ground between the paper lab notebook and the electronic lab notebook would be something like a smart pen, where you write on special paper with this special pen, and you have a paper and ink record of what you've written, but it also transmits everything to your computer, so you have a digital record of what's been written as well. So it's kind of cool for people who still want the paper lab notebook experience, but want to have digitized records as well. We also have data in terms of things like, that I mentioned, we have all these sensors around us. Those are collecting digital data. And then even things that we might not necessarily think of as being scientific data sources, things like social media and other, data that exists on the web, have been used in many cases for scientific research. So Twitter especially, there are a lot of researchers who have used that for tweets as the data for their research. One example would be when we're looking at sort of natural disasters. People have tracked, where people are tweeting about the natural disaster, how that's affected them. Same thing with illnesses. So there's a lot of data that you might not necessarily think of as being research data that can be used for some of those purposes. So another driver behind all of the data science that we're sort of seeing going on is that not only do we have a lot more data and we have it collected more quickly and all of that, we have more of that data actually available to people. It's in places where other people can get to it. So these are just a few examples of some of the many thousands of data repositories that exist. Some are sort of, broad in terms of the scope of what they'll take. Dryad, for example, Figshare, both are fairly generic repositories that you can upload pretty much any format, any subject matter of data for this. and you can, whatever you want, just put it there. Others are more specific to a particular area of science. For example, my favorite little logo is the mouse genome repository that has the cute little mouse on it. So a very, very specific type of data that they accept to that repository. Some institutions have institutional repositories that, if you're a researcher at that institution, you would deposit your data into that repository. So there are a lot of different places where we can get to data, fairly easily, and that much of that data is freely available to anyone who wants to use it. So this is a tremendous resource for people who are interested in doing research and getting a hold of some data. Part of how those data repositories get populated is that sometimes people just sort of want to share stuff for the good of science. But a lot of the ways that those repositories end up getting populated is because researchers are required to put their data in a repository for one reason or another. Journals, in many cases, have started to implement data sharing policies. Even some of the pretty big names that you would probably have heard of, BMJ, several of the Nature Publishing Group journals, PLOS, and many others. And then a lot of funders are also requiring that if you get funding from them, you're going to make the data publicly available. So currently the NSF was one of the first and is the probably most prominent that has like a data sharing policy. The NIH has a data sharing policy for currently a subset of people that get NIH funding. So if you get more than $500,000 per year on a grant, that data has to be shared. And then there are certain types of genomic data, both human and non-human, that have to be shared under the genomic data sharing policy. But I think that it's fair to say that going forward, more and more funders will have these types of policies that apply to all of their funding across the board. So, this is going to mean a couple of things for researchers. One, that there's going to be a lot more data available for people to use. So if I'm a researcher, I may not have to get grant funding to collect data. There may actually, that data may already exist that I can, get a hold of and analyze for my purposes. And two, researchers need to be thinking about, what are the implications for them in terms of sharing? Do they know what kind of repository they're going to need to share their data in? If they're going to share that data in that repository, do they need to have, a certain metadata standard that they have used with their data? Are there certain things that people might need to know, to contextualize this data? So there's a lot of thought really that has to go into data collection on the front end if you're going to plan to be sharing. And so those are definitely, like I said, things that researchers should start to be thinking about now. And that librarians who work with researchers can assist with and maybe encourage researchers to start being more aware of. All right, so we've talked about data. We've determined that there's a lot of it. What can we do with it? So data science is sort of a special way of approaching data, a sort of set of techniques that are, especially useful when we're talking about big data. So what are we referring to when we refer to data science? One of the things that's important to understand about data science is that it's not necessarily a subject-specific discipline, but it actually is more of a method or a technique that involves a lot of different expertise from a lot of different areas. So you may see people who are data scientists who sort of have expertise in all of these areas, or you might also see this take place more sort of in the context of a team where you have someone who has, the math expertise, someone who has the coding expertise, and then another person who has the subject matter expertise. But generally speaking, when we're talking about data science, we're either talking about an individual or a team with these different types of expertise. So an understanding of the sort of math and statistical elements of what we're going to talk about. I'll explain a little bit about some of the statistical methods that are commonly used in data science. Because of the fact that we're working with very large data sets, this isn't the kind of thing that you can, look at each individual data point by hand. We're going to have to write some code that will do that for us. So the advanced computing and the sort of hacker mindset are important pieces as well. Visualization, also important both in terms of, having the expertise to write the code to create visualizations, but also having an understanding of human visual perception and how to most effectively convey information about a very large data set with a visualization. And then finally, again, that domain expertise or that subject matter expertise is also really important. We can find patterns in data sometimes, but it's really important for a subject matter expert to look at that and sort of reality check whether that pattern is really legitimate or whether it's just sort of noise in our data. So having that subject matter expertise also super important. So another way of looking at this is this sort of Venn diagram where, again, we have the math and stats knowledge, we have the hacking or computational skills, and we have the subject matter expertise. And the area in which all three of those overlap is data science. So to sort of compare and contrast this with the traditional scientific method, you're probably familiar with the scientific method as it's sort of displayed in a chart like this. This is something that we learn, very early on in school. So, typically the scientific method would start with we develop some sort of a hypothesis about the way that the world works. We gather some data about that prediction that we've made, and then we, analyze that data to find out, does this data support the hypothesis that I had, or has my hypothesis been proven incorrect? And once we've done that, we can develop some general theories from that and apply those to the real world. And then, the whole thing's sort of circular from that. We generate some more hypotheses, test them, and so on. So this is how the scientific process, like I said, typically works. Things work a little bit differently in data science. Partly, actually, let me go back a little bit, partly because this formulate hypothesis portion of the scientific method isn't necessarily always the first step. So a lot of times when we have a very large data set, we know that, so for example, I have the genomic sequence of, 1 million cancer patients. I know that there's probably some significant, genes in this data set, but I don't necessarily know in advance what those genes are going to be. So it's difficult for me to generate a hypothesis like I think the, whatever gene is implicated in the development of cancer type X. Because there's just this huge data set that I don't necessarily know in advance of looking at it what's important and what is not. So in data science, a lot of times researchers are sort of starting more with the data set and finding the patterns within it. And it's a little bit of a different process than what we would think of as the traditional scientific method. So, because it's nice to sort of think about things in terms of process, we're not, totally throwing out method with data science. There is this pipeline that is sort of a useful way of thinking about how data science works. So we start first with what's called data ingestion. So we're getting data into our system. This may involve gathering it from several different web sources. A lot of web sources have what are called APIs, application programming interfaces, so we can essentially write a code that will go out and find data that meets the criteria that we're interested in. Sometimes that data will be data that we have ourselves collected. Sometimes that data will be given to us by another source. But in any event, we're gathering data and putting it into our system. The second step in that process is often referred to by many different names. You'll hear things like data munging, data wrangling, data cleaning, data processing. This is the portion of our work in which we, sort of get the data into shape. As you can imagine, a lot of the data that we're going to be pulling in to do this kind of analysis, I've mentioned lots of different sources, the web, people's, iPhones, different sensors. All these things were sort of collected for an original purpose that isn't necessarily the same purpose as what I, a data scientist, might want to use it for. And so a lot of times that data will need some sort of massaging to get it into the format that I might need to do my analysis. Often we're also sort of mashing up several different data sets. So maybe I have one example of an analysis that a researcher I worked with did is they were looking at gastrointestinal disease and the weather. So like is there a correlation between weather patterns and certain gastrointestinal illnesses? And so they had the weather data and they had the illness data, two completely different data sources, and they had to sort of get that to work together, in a way that made sense. So this phase of the data science pipeline, this wrangling or munging or whatever you want to call it, is one of the most important phases because that saying that you may have heard from computer science, garbage in, garbage out, very true in data science as well. And you're really going to have a very difficult time doing any sort of meaningful analysis on data if it's not, sort of organized in the right way. So it's an important step, and it's also typically the one where people spend the most time. So about 80% of the work in most data science is doing this data wrangling, which is frustrating to people because it's not like the exciting part where you're making discoveries, but it is super foundational and important to making sure your data are, correct. So after you've done that, then you can move on to the interesting part of the computation and analysis. We'll talk a little bit about some of the different types of analyses and algorithms that you might use in data science. But essentially, this is the portion of the data science pipeline where you are identifying patterns in data and sort of finding that meaning. So, what are the relationships between different variables and these sorts of things. Once you've sort of determined that, the next step is modeling and application. So the idea is that, we're doing this analysis for some purpose. We want to discover something or have some application that we can, put this into. So this modeling and application phase of the data science pipeline is where we are, sort of figuring out what we can do with the knowledge that we've found. And then finally, we have reporting and visualization. Often data science will be reported in the same way as typical science in terms of a peer-reviewed journal article. But a lot of other data science is more, sometimes for popular consumption. Other times it's more useful to demonstrate it visually. So there are a lot of different ways that the sort of output of the data science pipeline can be demonstrated to audiences. Like with many charts that demonstrate processes, you can kind of see that there are arrows going a lot of different directions with this. And so, I would give the caveat, as with most, pipelines or processes, it's a little bit artificial to think about this in terms of, specific steps that, stop and start at a particular point. It's really a very iterative process and involves a lot of, sort of back and forth. Maybe you get the data, you do some wrangling, try to do your analysis, realize, oh, data's not going to work in this format, so you go back and change it and, go forward again. So a lot of back and forth and, very iterative in nature, as many scientific processes are. So that is sort of the, broad view of what we're doing when we talk about data science. I wanted to talk a little bit about some more specifics within data science to give you a feel for, the types of things that people can do with data and, the types of discoveries that people might be able to make. So one of the very large areas and very popular, another sort of buzzword that you've probably heard about, is machine learning. So machine learning in data science typically sort of involves a couple things. So we have some data, like I said, typically a big data set, something that is large enough that it's going to be difficult for us humans to look at it and say, oh, yes, I see a pattern. So we have our big data, and then we'll feed that through some sort of algorithm, and that algorithm will help us to find those patterns, and from that we'll be able to develop a model, and then we can use that model on similar types of data to make predictions about how that data will work. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how this works, and hopefully this will make sense. So there are two types there are several types of machine learning, but two I want to talk about here. And the first one is what's called supervised learning. So in supervised learning, the reason it's called supervised is that we have data points that are already labeled with our outcome of interest. So for example, here I have a bunch of different images. I think these are x-rays of lungs, and someone, a subject matter expert, has gone through and labeled them as being either sick or healthy. I think the people that are sick have tuberculosis. This is a supervised learning task because our data have been labeled with the endpoint of sick or healthy. And then the idea is that we can feed this labeled data into an algorithm, and the algorithm will essentially learn what are the important parts of an image, or in the vocabulary of machine learning, these would be called features. So what are the features that are important for distinguishing a healthy lung from a sick lung? So this, could be a lot of different things depending on the type of image or the type of data that we're looking at. So for example, if we, are looking at these images, we might see, okay, in the sick lungs, it looks like there's a lot more white than in the healthy lungs. There's a lot more, negative space black. Maybe that's what the important thing is. Another example could be, if you're on Facebook, you may have seen that a lot of times now they have, before the image even loads, it'll sort of like know what it is, like, oh, that's a picture of a dog, or that's a picture of a sunset. So it's sort of learned like what colors make a sunset, or what, sort of shapes are often associated with a dog. So image learning is, one application for this. This could also be done with numeric data or, text data. So there's a lot of different things you could put into the algorithm, and essentially it would, figure out what features are important and predictive of whether the lung is sick or healthy or whatever it might be. And then the whole idea of this is that if we had similar images, then we would be able to put that in to the model that we've developed, and then the computer would be able to tell us, is that lung sick or healthy? So it allows us to classify similar types of data based on what we've learned with the original data. So with this, one of the things that we have to be careful about is overfitting. So in the image that you see here, we've got some blue dots and we've got some red dots, and imagine that this is on a Cartesian coordinate. We've got an X and a Y axis, and the position of the dot corresponds to an X and a Y value. And if we wanted to be able to come up with an equation that would allow us to distinguish between the red and the blue, we could come up with a very complex equation that would be characterized by this green line that you see here, that would perfectly 100% accurately split the blue dots from the red dots. However, that would typically only work in the case of this exact data. We're always going to have some outliers in our data that don't, necessarily easily fit the pattern. So anytime that we're using a machine learning algorithm, we really don't want to get one that will 100% accurately predict our training data, because most likely that is overfit to that training data, and it will perform poorly on other data. So basically we've taught it the intricacies of this one data set, which may not be representative of the actual reality of the world on the whole. And so what we would, hope to end up with is something that's more like this black line, where it, does a pretty good job of splitting between the two groups. It gets a few wrong, but it's mostly able to pick out sort of where the red category starts and where the blue category starts. So, when we're doing, again, this sort of machine learning sort of algorithm, we don't really want to see 100% accuracy on our training data, because in all likelihood that is not going to perform very well on real world data. Oops. Okay, so one of the ways that we avoid falling into that trap of overfitting is that rather than training our model on our entire set of labeled data, we'll split that data up. And we'll use, typically you use about 80% of that labeled data as your training data. So that's the data that you feed into the algorithm that, the labeled lungs that we're going to put in and have the algorithm figure out which features are important to tell between healthy and sick. But we're going to hold back about 20% of that labeled data, and we're going to use that to test our new algorithm. So the test data has the labels because it came from that labeled data pool. We know whether it's a sick lung or a healthy lung, and we want to see, can we correctly predict whether, or can our algorithm correctly predict whether the lung is sick or healthy? And that will give us a sense of how well this algorithm would perform in the real world. So there are a lot of different ways of splitting our data up and doing this, but typically most supervised learning algorithms will try to split up the data like this, where we have some training data and some test or validation data. Another machine learning sort of application is kind of the opposite of what we've looked at, supervised learning, and that is called unsupervised learning. So in unsupervised learning, we have some data, but it's not necessarily labeled. We don't know sort of the endpoint that we're looking at. And an unsupervised learning algorithm will essentially find clusters of similar data points. So if I put in all my little dots here, the unsupervised learning algorithm will be able to pull out, here are 3 different groups of data points that are similar to each other. So the algorithm doesn't necessarily, it can't necessarily tell us like what each cluster means. This is where a subject matter expert would have to come in and look. Like the computer doesn't understand, okay, one is red, one is green, one is blue. I, as the human, would have to come in and make that characterization. But the computer can find the data points that are most similar to each other. So one application for this is, so for example, if we had, let's say we had a whole bunch of articles from PubMed, and we wanted to find the articles that are similar to each other. We might put in, just the mesh terms that go with those articles, or we might put in the entire, text of those articles, and an algorithm like this would then, say, we would tell it, put this into 10 groups. It would create 10 groups of the articles that are the most similar to each other, and then we, as subject matter experts, would have to go back and say, okay, I see a lot of mesh terms in this group that are about, things like cancer and neoplasms and, chemotherapy. So this is probably a group about cancer treatment. And this other group, Group B, has a lot of stuff about the heart and, EKGs or something. So we, the subject matter expert humans, would be the ones to label those clusters after this sort of an unsupervised learning algorithm came in and identified the clusters. So that's a very, very brief overview of a very complicated topic. And then a final application for data science that I'll mention is text mining and natural language processing. So the 2 previous types of machine learning that we looked at can be used on natural language, but human spoken written language is really difficult for computers to parse because language is complex. There's a lot of relationships in sentences. There's a lot of subtlety to how language is used. So natural language processing is its own sort of field of study and research. But the idea behind a lot of this, so sort of doing this text mining and finding information from natural language, involves labeling entities within like a sentence or a corpus, a body of text, and identifying relationships among those entities. So in this example, we have a fairly simple couple of sentences, but there's a lot of different entities or things going on in this sentence. So a natural language processing algorithm might have, be able to recognize that, okay, William Shakespeare is a person, that's an author. More specifically, he's a playwright, and he has the property of being a citizen of the country England, and that country has the property of having English as its spoken language. So there's all these sorts of relationships that are going on here, and being able to parse out those relationships and those entities is essentially how natural language processing can work. A computer can't really take a sentence and just interpret the sentence. It really has to be able to break apart the parts of that sentence, and that is sort of the area where natural language processing is working in its sort of incarnation today. So again, just a few really quick introductions to some of the techniques that are used. What are the tools that are used to do these things? There are some data scientists that are using proprietary tools, so things that you may have heard of like MATLAB and SAS and SPSS and Stata. These are typically expensive, so researchers may not be able to afford them for their lab. The other thing is that because they are proprietary, data is in a closed format. It's not an open format that anyone can use. So this sort of limits the amount of data sharing that you can do. It means that, if I want to share my data with someone else, they have to have that same program. It also somewhat limits the portability of your data just for yourself. So a lot of times we have a lot of postdocs at the NIH, and they want to learn a skill that they're going to be able to take to the next lab where they work. They're not going to stay at the NIH forever. They're going to go on and get another job somewhere else. And it may be that their lab at NIH has SPSS, but maybe the next lab that they go to doesn't have SPSS. And so I think it's a little bit more practical to learn one of the open source sort of solutions that you see on the right hand of your screen. So things like R, Python, Julia, JavaScript, a whole bunch of other things that people use are programming languages. So the learning curve is a little bit steep. It is like learning a language, but the nice thing is that they're free, they're open source, they can take almost any kind of data and read it, and because of the fact that they're free, it's not a problem. When you go on to your next lab, you just get this, download it for free, no big deal. So these are the types of things that data scientists are more typically using. So R is my programming language of choice. I feel like it's very approachable for beginners to learn, very commonly used in data science applications. Python, also not super hard for beginners. I think it's a little more complicated than R, personally, for myself. Also used in a lot of, especially bioinformatics types of applications. And then Julia is sort of a newer one, and I think it's not as widely used, but has some potential, interesting things available. So I mentioned that learning to code does sort of take a long time. You are learning a language, but I do like to emphasize to people that there's a lot of good reasons to take the time to learn how to code. So one is that essentially when we learn how to code, you're sort of opening yourself up to being able to do a lot of different things that you wouldn't be able to do with point-and-click programs. So, a point-and-click program essentially is a set of tasks that are predefined. If you want to, work with a spreadsheet, you use Excel. If you want to write a Word document or like a, text document, you work with Word. But they don't, there's only so many things that they can do. When you code, on the other hand, there's really a lot of options that you have to customize and do your own sort of novel analysis, create completely novel types of charts. So I kind of like to say that it's like the difference between going to the grocery store and getting a box of cake mix and like knowing how to bake and coming up with your own cake and choosing the flavor that you want. The cake box or cake mix box is easier and it doesn't require a whole lot of expertise, but you're kind of limited. You get a vanilla cake or you get a chocolate cake. The baking your own cake, it's harder. You have to know more, but you can do whatever you want. And the same thing is kind of true of coding. So sort of a practical example of that, this kind of ugly chart that you see on the screen here was something that a researcher from NIH had created with Excel, and he knew that there were big problems with this chart. So each of the color lines here is a different participant or a patient, and part of the problem was that they had different number of data points for each of the patients. Some patients, they had 10 points, some were lost to follow-up, so they didn't have all the points, and there was a lot of weird stuff going on with this chart that made it not very pretty to look at. So I was able to take the same data and work with it in R and came up with some charts that I feel like were a lot easier to read. So I gave this researcher two different options. One that puts all of the participants on the same chart, and one that breaks it out by participant so you can sort of see each of the different individuals easily. So this is the code that was used to create that. As you can see, it's somewhat complex if you're not familiar with all of this. But the nice thing about it is that I can save this code and I can share it with anyone. So if someone said, oh, how did you make those cool charts? I would be able to say, here is the code for it. I can reuse this on my own data. So in this example, this person was going to be collecting a lot of the same data for a lot of different patients. And basically all he had to do was just make sure that everything was sort of like arranged in the same order. And this same code could be used to create this chart for any number of patients that he would be collecting data on. It's also nice because if I decide that I want to go back and forth, I decided I don't really like everybody on the same chart. I want to split those people out into separate charts. That's really just one line of code to change, and it's fairly easy for me to sort of manipulate the chart and get to exactly what I want. So I think this is nice to be able to have your work documented for yourself, but it's even more important, now that reproducibility is a huge problem in a lot of different fields of scientific research. Having this type of a record of the work that you did sort of protects you from, any sorts of, questions about how exactly you did your work. It's all easily documented for you. So that has been sort of a very quick introduction to a fairly complex topic. I hope you found that somewhat interesting and are maybe inspired to learn more about it. And so thinking ahead about, what are the things that we need to be looking at in the future? What are the skills that we might need as librarians or that researchers might need? What are some of the things that are going to be some of the pain points going forward? One thing that we can be sure of is that data is only going to continue to get bigger. We are seeing, a huge increase in the amount of data that's generated on a daily basis. And, as I said, it's cheaper than ever to store it and to generate it. So we are definitely, not going to be getting any less data anytime soon. So this is a huge problem to be thinking about. How are we going to, work with all of this data? Where are we going to store it? How much do we need to save? Do we really need to save all of it? Another thing that I think is going to be increasingly important going forward is figuring out how we can make use of what's called unstructured data. So the structured data is that sort of well-organized, neatly labeled data. So a spreadsheet would be an example of structured data. Anything where you have, a list of variables and values for those variables. But that structured data is really only the tip of the iceberg of all of the data that we have available in the world today. Much more of the data that we have is unstructured data. So that would be things like, free text. We talked about natural language processing. That would be things like, tweets, like Facebook status updates. Basically anything that is not sort of pre-processed to have labels and structure. So there's a lot that can be, potentially discovered using that type of data, but the techniques that we need to effectively analyze it are different from the techniques that we employ on structured data, and they're a little bit more difficult to work with, and it requires, sorts of new developments to be able to work with this more complicated data. Another thing that's, I think, really important to think about is training the workforce. We talked about how there are these different sorts of sets of skills that you need to be a data scientist. It's not enough just to have the subject matter expertise. You also need the stats and the coding. The researcher of today is a little bit different than, the historical researcher. And I kind of like this analogy that the classical researcher is T-shaped, that they have a very deep knowledge in a particular domain specialty, but the breadth of their knowledge is not very wide. If you know anyone that has gotten a PhD, I'm in a PhD program right now, and it's like you learn a lot about one very, very specific thing. But going forward, researchers are going to need to be more, broad in their knowledge. And so the analogy here is that the modern researcher needs to be pie-shaped. So they need to have a depth of knowledge, not just in a subject matter, but also in, doing the stats, having the coding skills to do some of that work. So not just deep, but also wide knowledge. So to sort of talk a little bit about how I work with a lot of the stuff that we've discussed, I am the coordinator of the Data Services Program at my library, the NIH library, often confused with NLM, but we are the library that serves researchers on the campus of the NIH. And so we have a lot of researchers who are working with a lot of different types of data. And the thing that I have found, just sort of anecdotally in working with researchers, but also in some of the research that I've done and a lot of the research that's been done in general in the field, is that a lot of researchers haven't had the kind of training that they need to do all of this kind of data science. So we are at a point where a lot of the currently working researchers do need training on tools. And so that's a big part of what I do. There are a lot of researchers at NIH and only one of me. So I feel like a really effective way to approach that community is to do classes where I can get many people at once and teach them something. Most of the time that, what they learn in one of those classes will give them sort of the background that they need to be effective, but a lot of times people need some additional help in figuring out, okay, now I know how to use the R programming language, but how do I use it for my particular type of analysis or to create a visualization or whatever it might be. So I also do a lot of consultations on how to, use the things that I teach in particular areas. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting and I like to do is assistance with locating data sets for like sort of the raw data of doing data science. As we've discussed, there is a lot of data available in the world today, but it's kind of tricky to find it. So in the same way that a librarian is someone who sort of knows how to use PubMed and might be able to find the article that, someone's looking for more quickly because they know the tricks like using mesh terms and that sort of thing. Same thing is kind of true with locating data sets. So, researchers don't have that sort of, they're not as conversant with what are the repositories and how to search them. So that's something that I assist with. And then I think another really important thing is building community. There are a lot of people, I'm sure this is true in other communities, but especially at the NIH, that are really interested in learning this stuff, but they're very busy. They don't necessarily, have time to like take a whole semester-long class. But there's a lot of people that are like willing to teach them stuff. So how do we get those people together that have, the expertise and the interest in learning, and, people want to get together and like share some of the cool stuff that they've worked on, and other people can learn from that. So a lot of what I try to do is work on developing those sorts of things. We recently started a mentoring program to connect people that are interested in mentoring and people that want to learn. We have events like Pi Day is coming up March 14th. Pi is 3.14, so we celebrate Pi Day on 3/14, and we'll have talks and that sort of thing. So I think getting people together to share the expertise that they have and the problems that they have is a really important way of sort of furthering data science as well. So I will end there. I think there's a little time for questions. If you have any questions that we don't get to in this session, feel free to follow up with me by email. I'm also on Twitter, and I blog at that address that is in no way official to the NIH. I write a lot of stuff there about data and about my PhD program and also about my dog. So if you're interested in any of that, check it out. But I'm happy to take any questions that you have at this point.
Thank you, Lisa. This is Elizabeth again. We'll wait and see if anybody puts a question in the chat box. But I was curious, because your background was more in, social sciences, et cetera. What stimulated your interest in moving into the, the data science area?
So my first master's degree was in English, and I never thought that I would end up being a data science librarian, but I was very interested in this when I was in library school, and I took a class on data, and I ended up a couple of years ago, the National Library of Medicine gave out these informationist grants for people to do work sort of embedded in a research team. And my project that I got the grant for focused on data. And so it was just something that I found was very interesting, and it seemed like an area where people needed a lot of help and I could provide a lot of assistance. And so that is sort of how I got interested. And, my background, like you say, is more in social science. But, there's a lot of free resources that you can learn this stuff. So if you have an interest, there's definitely, you don't have to put in a whole lot of, money or time necessarily to learn it. There's a ton of free resources that, I think it's well worth the investment of time to learn this stuff because, it has, it's made me really much more useful to my users than if I didn't know it. So.
All right, thank you for that. And what is your PhD going to be in?
So I'm working on a PhD in information science at the University of Maryland, and my research focus is on how researchers reuse data.
Okay, great.
Oh, we have a question from somebody here in the room.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm just wondering, as the NIH Library Data Science effort is also part of the NIH BD2K initiative?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those of you that are not familiar, NIH has this initiative called BD2K, which stands for Big Data to Knowledge. And the efforts of the BD2K initiative have really been sort of outward facing. They've done a lot of stuff sort of on developing community tools for data science. So like one of the things that they're funding is it's called BioCaddy. It's essentially going to be like the PubMed for data. So rather than having to go to all 1,000 different repositories, you can search across all of them with one tool. They're doing a lot in terms of training. They're doing stuff in terms of developing computational methods. And I work a lot with the BD2K group. So we're not like officially connected with them, but I sit on several working groups and those sorts of things. So if any of you that are listening that are interested in funding, BD2K is potentially something to look at. A lot of libraries have gotten funding to work on things like open educational resources, like training for librarians and data. So if you have an interest, that can definitely be something, a potential funding source.
Great. We posted a link to that initiative in the chat box for anybody who might be interested. So I don't see, does anybody else here? Remember, if you have a question quickly before we end, you can put a question or a comment in the chat box and send it to all participants. And while we're waiting to see if any questions come in here in the closing minutes, I just want to point out that if anybody is going to the Preparedness Summit in Atlanta, April 25 through 28, the Disaster Information Management Research Center will have a booth there and be doing some presentations. And also during the same time at the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine Congress in Toronto. Anybody's going to that, we'll be there as well. And there'll be people at MLA for anybody who may be going to that over Memorial Day weekend in Seattle. So we don't have, I think we just have a couple of, I asked questions to the host. Did you see that? Do we have a question there? Well, then we're checking that out. So
I can see it here. So the question is, how are metadata applied in big data? Is it like with archives, big picture overview, finding guide with links to other data sets, or individual experiment metadata using something like Dublin Core organized into cataloging software? So yeah, so metadata is a really good question. And there's a lot of differences in different fields. So how people do things in one discipline may be very different from how they do it in another. And there's also a lot of differences in the sort of granularity, which I think you were sort of getting at with the big picture kind of thing. So there's a lot of discussion about like what exactly is a data set? Is a particular data point a data set, or is this whole group of data a data set, and what level do we need metadata? And how can those different metadata schemas interoperate with each other? So there's not one good answer to that. It's more sort of defined by the field in which someone would be working, and also there's a lot of development in that area to make things more interoperable.
Okay, thank you. There's some more questions. Can you see the questions, Lisa?
Yes. Okay. So a question about platform for big data, Hadoop, MapReduce, MongoDB, or something else. Do you allow users to deposit materials automatically, or are they curated in some way? So at this point, and I don't know what the future plans are for NLM, there's not really like a central repository for NIH data. So there's not really one answer to that. In terms of, the actual day-to-day work that people are doing, I know that there are people using Hadoop, there are people using MongoDB and a lot of other solutions. But at this point, there's not, like I said, a single NIH repository where everything's deposited. I see there's another question about roles for librarians or archivists when working with big data. And I think that there's a lot of potential roles. And if you look at, there's a lot of librarians who are working in this area around the country. And, a lot of them are writing articles or book chapters about what they're doing. And a lot of them have taken really different approaches. So, I really like teaching R, and I, do that a lot. And I think that's really useful for my user community. I know other people are focusing on, things like more of the data management planning. Other people do stuff with like REDCap. So there are a ton of opportunities, and I think that it's important to get out and see what your community is interested in, so what can be most useful to them, where are some of the gaps in services at your institution, and kind of see where you can be the most useful. So I know we're at the end of the time. I see there's still some questions, but I don't know if you guys want me to just maybe follow up with this individual on this, or I'm happy to stick around if...
You can go ahead and answer the questions, and anybody who wants to stick around can listen in.
Okay. So there's another question about machine learning algorithms, and does NIH NLM offer their algorithms anywhere for the public to use? So that's a really good question. There has been sort of a movement in government in general to make more of the government software open source. And I think we're in a really good position to do that at the NIH because, other government institutions may have, if they're working like with, I don't know, like the CIA, they probably can't make their software open source. But there is a lot of interest at the NIH in sharing a lot of the software and algorithms that are used. A lot of people are doing that on GitHub. And not just the NIH, but GitHub is a code sharing site that's very widely used. And a lot of, researchers at the NIH and elsewhere will, mention in an article where the algorithm can be found. So I think just in general, there's a lot more that needs to be done to help publicize a lot of this kind of stuff. A lot of people make very cool tools that don't, maybe get the attention that they need. And so I hope that some of the efforts that the BD2K group has been working on will make not just the data, but also the algorithms a little more publicly available. And then I see there's another question about process-oriented simulations using big data, such as different steps that an antibody might attach to a cell or bacteria. I'm not really aware of anything like that. I know that, there's a ton of, if you're interested in any of the, like publicly available NIH data, NCBI has a lot of different data repositories that house different kinds of data. I don't know that they have sort of the simulation kind of stuff that you're referring to, but they definitely have data relevant to that. So I think that's all the questions.
Let's see. Yeah, that would be the end of the questions, I think, right now. And we just want to thank you tremendously for giving this presentation to our audience. Obviously, there was some good questions there and stimulate a lot of thought. This is a whole new direction, again, for librarians, and the combination of information science and librarianship really, it's really apparent here how the two relate, and a whole new skill set to learn. But resources are out there to learn it. So if there aren't any other questions, we put the slide on the screen about if anybody wanted to get the MLA CE credits. We have that up there. Our next webinar will likely be in 2 months in June. I think the exact date is June 8th. I think, is the next session. Oh, I'm sorry, May. I skipped May, I'm sorry. May 11th. Apologize. Okay, so May 11th. And again, Lisa, thank you very much. And if anybody would like to get in touch with her, she did provide her contact information. And if for some reason you can't find that, you can always contact us and we can connect you. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll sign off now.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.